There's a moment every person who leads anything eventually runs into, and it has nothing to do with skill or experience. It's the moment you're asked, directly or just by circumstance, to convince someone else that this is worth doing, and you realize, standing there, that you're not actually sure you believe it yourself. For me, that moment showed up in an ordinary conversation, not a dramatic one. Someone close to me asked, not unkindly, what exactly I thought running alone in a forest and talking about a leadership book was actually going to add up to. It's a fair question. I gave a fine-sounding answer at the time, something about discipline and consistency and proving something to myself. But driving home afterward, I noticed the answer had come out smoothly, almost too smoothly, the way a rehearsed line comes out rather than a genuinely examined one. That gap between how easily I could explain this and how recently I'd actually stopped to check whether I still meant it was the first sign that this chapter had something for me specifically. The two men who wrote Extreme Ownership ran into a version of this in a much harder context than mine. Leading soldiers into genuinely dangerous missions, they discovered something uncomfortable. You cannot fake belief convincingly enough for long enough to lead anyone through real difficulty. People executing in order they sense their leader doesn't actually believe and will feel that gap, even if nobody says it out loud, and their effort will quietly match it. Compliance without belief produces a hollow, breakable kind of following. The chapter is called Believe, and the whole argument comes down to one requirement. Before you can lead anyone else through something hard, including yourself, you have to actually believe the mission is worth it. I want to spend this episode on that because it's the one idea in this whole series that I think about more than any other, usually at the exact moments it matters most, somewhere around minute 20 of a cold, tired run, when the honest question shows up uninvited. Do I actually believe this changes anything, or have I just been repeating a story to a camera long enough that it started to sound convincing? Here's the part of the chapter that reframed this for me. The authors weren't just talking about belief in the abstract sense, some vague positive feeling about the mission. They were talking about a specific, almost mechanical requirement. A leader has to understand the actual reason behind an order well enough to explain it honestly, and has to have personally worked through their own doubts about it before asking anyone else to commit. Skipping that step doesn't just risk your own motivation. It risks everyone who's trusting your conviction as a substitute for having examined the reasoning themselves. Translate that to a channel built on one person, alone, in a forest before sunrise. There's no unit to lead here in the traditional sense, but there absolutely is someone whose commitment depends on whether the belief behind this is real. You, tomorrow morning, deciding whether to trust the version of you talking tonight. And if this channel is doing what it's meant to do, there's an audience too, people deciding whether your conviction is something they can actually borrow to get themselves out the door, or whether it's a performance they can sense the edges of. Let me tell you about the specific week this stopped being theoretical for me. About 4 months into this project, the running was going fine, the discipline was mostly holding, but something quieter had started to erode underneath it. The videos weren't getting much attention. Nobody outside a small handful of people seemed to notice or care. And somewhere in that stretch, I caught myself going through the motions of belief rather than actually holding it, saying the lines about discipline and consistency into a microphone with less and less connection to whether I actually thought any of it mattered beyond the exercise itself. That's a specific, recognizable failure state, and it's worth naming precisely instead of just calling it losing motivation, because the fix is different depending on what's actually eroding. In my case, the belief hadn't disappeared because running stopped working. Physically, everything was still improving. It had eroded because I'd quietly attached the belief to an outcome I didn't control, audience growth, instead of to the actual mission underneath it, which had never been about views in the first place. Once I could see that clearly, the fix wasn't more motivation. It was going back to the original reason, the one that existed before there was a channel at all, and checking whether that reason still held up on its own, independent of any numbers attached to it. It did. What had failed wasn't the belief. It was a borrowed metric I'd let quietly replace it. That's one specific way belief erodes, and I want to offer a few different versions of this because the diagnosis matters more than any generic pep talk about staying motivated. Some people lose belief because the reason they started was never really their own to begin with. They picked up someone else's, a coach's philosophy, a borrowed goal, a trend that looked convincing from the outside, and it worked for a while on borrowed momentum, until the moment came where only a genuinely personal reason could carry them through, and there wasn't one underneath the borrowed one. If this sounds familiar, the useful question isn't how do I get motivated again? It's was this reason ever actually mine, or did I skip the step of building one and just adopted someone else's? I've watched this happen with people who take up running specifically because a friend did, or because a particular influencer made it look transformative, with no real personal reason underneath the borrowed one. It can carry someone for weeks, sometimes months, especially if there's social reinforcement attached to it. But the first time real difficulty shows up, an injury, a bad month, a stretch where nobody's watching or cheering, the borrowed reason tends to evaporate almost instantly because it was never actually load-bearing. It was decoration on top of a structure that was never built. Others lose belief the way I did, by quietly swapping the real mission for a measurable proxy of it, then losing faith when the proxy stalls even though the actual mission is still fully intact. If the honest answer to why did I start this was ever about becoming someone more consistent, more capable, more at peace with a body that's given you trouble, and somewhere along the way that got replaced by a number on a screen, a pace on a watch, a scale reading, the fix is going back to the original sentence and testing whether it still holds, not manufacturing enthusiasm for the metric that replaced it. Numbers are useful as feedback. They become dangerous the moment they quietly become the actual reason, because numbers plateau, dip, and disappoint in ways that a genuine mission usually doesn't. And a third group loses belief simply from isolation, from doing something real and difficult with literally no one around who understands why it matters for long enough that the absence of outside confirmation starts to feel like evidence the thing itself doesn't matter. This is maybe the hardest one, because unlike the first two, there's no flawed reasoning to correct. The belief was genuine and well-founded the whole time. What eroded wasn't the logic. It was the simple, human difficulty of holding a conviction alone for months without anyone reflecting it back to you. This is incidentally part of why I eventually decided to put any of this on camera at all, even without showing my face. Saying the reasoning out loud, even to an audience of strangers, turned out to do something that thinking it privately never quite managed. It made the belief harder to quietly let drift because it was now, in some small way, on the record. There's a fourth version worth naming too, one that's specific to anyone carrying an old injury or a body that's already let them down before. Belief that quietly gets undermined by the body itself, rather than by circumstance or isolation. It sounds like this, almost as background noise rather than a clear thought. Even if the mission is right, this particular body has already shown it can't fully deliver on it. So why keep believing in something the evidence keeps arguing against? I've had that thought more times than I can count, usually right after a flare-up, when the most recent data point feels louder than every consistent week that came before it. The honest correction here isn't to ignore the body's evidence. It's to notice that one data point, even a painful one, was never the whole trial. Belief in the mission was never a bet that the body would behave perfectly. It was a bet that the mission was worth pursuing within whatever the body actually allows, adjusted honestly, week to week, rather than abandoned the first time it pushes back. If isolation is the actual cause in your case, the fix isn't more willpower or a better journal entry. It's finding even one person or one honest recording like this one that lets the belief exist somewhere outside your own head for a moment. It doesn't need to be a large community or public accountability. It just needs to break the specific pattern where a genuinely sound conviction slowly, starts to feel unreal simply because it's never been said out loud to anyone but you. There's a distinction worth making before going further, because it's easy to confuse belief with something it isn't. Believing in the mission was never presented in this book as certainty about the outcome. The leaders they describe often had no guarantee a specific operation would succeed, no promise the risk would pay off exactly as planned. What they had instead was conviction that the mission itself was the right one to pursue, regardless of how any single attempt at it turned out. That's a meaningfully different thing from confidence in a result, and conflating the two is probably the single most common way belief quietly collapses. Applied here, that means believing in this project was never supposed to require knowing in advance that the knee holds up, that the channel grows, that 4 months from now looks better than 4 months ago. Demanding that level of certainty before allowing yourself to believe in the mission sets a bar that no honest pursuit of anything difficult could ever clear. What you can actually know, and what belief is supposed to rest on instead, is something smaller and sturdier. That showing up honestly, dealing with what's real about your body instead of a story about it, and treating each day as its own decision rather than an extension of a streak is the right way to spend this effort, independent of exactly how the outcome unfolds. The book's own leaders had days where the tactical situation looked genuinely bad, where by any reasonable measure things weren't going according to plan, and they still didn't lose belief in the underlying mission, because the belief had never been staked on a guaranteed outcome in the first place. That's worth remembering on the mornings this feels like it isn't working. A bad week of training isn't evidence against a mission. It's just a bad week, exactly as survivable as any other, as long as the belief was never resting on every week going well to begin with. Here's the part the authors were careful about, and it matters here too. Believing in the mission was never presented as requiring total agreement with every detail of how it's executed. The authors describe genuinely disagreeing at times with specific decisions or approaches coming from above them, while still believing completely in the larger mission those decisions served. That distinction matters enormously for anyone doing this alone. You're allowed to doubt a specific method, a specific week's plan, a specific piece of advice you tried and didn't love, without that doubt spreading into doubt about the whole project. Believing in the mission of becoming more consistent and more capable is a different, sturdier thing than believing every single tactic you've tried along the way was the right one. Conflating the two is how one bad training block turns into a full crisis of purpose, when really only one input needed adjusting. Here's what this actually looks like as a practice, and I want to keep it to one thing instead of scattering it across 5. The same as always. Take 5 honest minutes tonight and write down the actual reason you started this, in your own words, stripped of anything that sounds like it was written for an audience. Not the version you'd say on camera. The version that was true before anyone was watching, if anyone ever is. Then hold that sentence up against whatever's actually been driving your motivation the last few weeks, and check honestly whether they still match, or whether something else has quietly slid into that spot instead. A number, someone else's borrowed reason, a comparison to someone further along than you. If they match, you're not dealing with a belief problem at all, whatever it feels like from the inside. You're dealing with normal fatigue or a normal hard week, and the honest sentence from a few episodes back still applies. Name what happened, decide the one adjustment, move forward. But if they don't match, if the thing driving you lately turns out to be a proxy instead of the actual reason, that's worth fixing directly before you spend another month trying to motivate yourself toward a number instead of mission. I'd add one more layer to this practice, connected to that conversation I mentioned earlier. At some point, probably sooner than you'd expect, someone is going to ask you directly why you're doing this. A version of the same question I got in the car that day. Don't treat that question as an interruption to brush off with a smooth, rehearsed answer. Treat it as a free, regular audit of whether the reason you wrote down tonight still holds up when you have to say it out loud, to another person in real time without editing it first. If the answer comes out easily and it still feels true while you're saying it, that's a good sign. If it comes out easily but feels hollow the moment it leaves your mouth, that's worth paying attention to, because that's usually the belief itself quietly asking for a second look, in the same way mine was that evening in the car, whether or not you consciously notice it happening. There's also a version of this worth doing for anyone who's been running consistently for a while and has genuinely stopped doubting the mission. You've done the work of examining it. It holds up, and this chapter mostly confirms what you already know. For you, the more useful move might be smaller. Notice where your explained belief could actually help someone else's, the way explaining a decision to a team builds their belief rather than just their compliance. A short, honest conversation about why this actually matters to you, offered to one person who's on the edge of starting something similar, does more for their belief than any amount of them watching your results from a distance ever could. There's one more thing worth saying honestly before I close this out, because it's easy to make belief sound like something you settle once and then carry forward unchanged. It doesn't work that way. Not for the two men who wrote this chapter, and not for anyone running a version of this alone. Belief gets tested repeatedly, not once. Expecting to never doubt the mission again after one clarifying evening is its own kind of unrealistic story. The actual skill isn't permanent, unshakable conviction. It's knowing how to go back to the original reason quickly, honestly, and without drama every time the doubt shows up again, which it will probably before this season of running is over, and probably more than once. I think this is actually the more useful way to think about the whole chapter, and it's the part one underestimated the first time I read it. It's tempting to imagine belief as something you either have or don't, a fixed possession you either successfully secured early on or permanently lack. That framing makes every wobble feel catastrophic, as if a single evening of doubt means the whole foundation was fake all along. The more accurate picture, at least from where I'm standing after a year of this, is that belief behaves less like a possession and more like a muscle you keep re-engaging. It gets tired. It gets tested by boredom, by isolation, by a stretch of bad weeks that don't seem to add up to anything visible yet. None of that is proof the belief was hollow to begin with. It's just what happens to any real conviction that has to survive contact with an ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday over and over for longer than a person's initial enthusiasm was ever built to last on its own. A muscle that gets re-engaged also gets stronger with the specific kind of use this chapter describes, which is worth sitting with for a moment before closing out. Every time you go back to the original reason, check it honestly and find it still holds. That's not neutral. It's not just avoiding a collapse. The belief that survives an honest check tends to come back sturdier than it was before the doubt showed up. The same way a muscle that's actually been tested comes back stronger than one that's simply been assumed to be fine. That's the part that makes the whole practice worth doing on purpose, rather than only when a crisis forces it. Tomorrow morning, it will still be dark when you tie your shoes. The reason you're doing this doesn't need to feel loud or certain every single day to still be real. It just needs to actually be yours, checked honestly against what's been driving you lately, instead of quietly replaced by something easier to measure and harder to believe in. I'll see you on the trail tomorrow. Same time, same choice. This is Run to Evolve. One day, one run, one lesson, no excuses.